When riders came for the boys, they did not hide what they were there to do. They entered the village, called the families together, and had the boys brought forward one by one, deciding who would be taken and who would be left behind. Milan saw them first from the upper pasture. The slope above the village was thin with late autumn. Grass clung in dull patches between stone. Thorn bushes sat low and grey along the hillside. A few bare saplings leaned under the wind. His goats were spread wide, picking at what remained before the frost sealed the ground. He stood with his crook tucked against his forearm, watching a stubborn young doe nose at a strip of bark. She had found a place where the scrub clung to the rock and was pulling at it in small, angry jerks. Then movement crossed the road below. Milan lifted his head. Through the trees along the south road, horsemen were rising out of the folds of the land. He stepped onto a flat stone near the ridge and set the end of the crook down hard before trusting his weight to it. From there, he could see the road more clearly where it bent between the bare trunks. Two at the front, not slouched in the saddle like men coming from market, not burdened, no sacks, no rolled blankets, no chickens tied by the feet, no trade goods knocking against the flanks of their horses. Their cloaks were dark and even, cut from good wool, hanging clean across the back. Behind them came another pair, then another. The line kept its shape where the road narrowed, closed over the rise, then opened again. Milan counted under his breath. 4, 6, 8, 10. More came over the bend. 12, 15. Then the armed escort behind them began to show themselves fully. Spears, short bows, men who rode as if distance between one horse and the next had been measured before they ever reached the road. 20. Still more beyond them. Milan stopped counting. He did not need the rest. For one moment, he remained on the stone with the wind striking one side of his face, looking down past the road to the village below. Smoke climbed from a few chimneys in thin, white strands. A woman crossed a yard with a basket against her hip. Someone had laid wood beside a wall to dry. A dog slept in a patch of light near a fence. Then he stepped down. His first step slid on loose gravel. He caught himself on the crook, steadied, and began down the slope as quickly as age allowed. He did not run. He could not have run if the hillside had been on fire. The ground forced care from him. Stones turned under his boots. Once he had to stop and plant the crook again before taking the next step. His breathing thickened in his chest. The goats looked up as he passed, but did not follow. The young doe gave a short complaint into the wind and bent back to the bark. At the bottom, the path opened into the lower field where Dragan was working beside his cart. He had one boot braced against the wheel and was stacking split wood into the bed in tight rows, turning each piece so it would ride square. His horse stood harnessed beside him, head low, tail still. Milan came off the path and stopped near the shaft. Dragan looked over at once. "What is it?" Milan pointed with the crook toward the road. "Riders." Dragan set the wood in his hands into the cart, then stepped around the horse and looked through the trees. For a moment, neither man spoke. The front of the column crossed an opening in the trunks, vanished, then appeared again. "There are riders," Milan said. "I see them." "From the south road." Dragan narrowed his eyes. The road cut between two stands of bare oak. The line came through in order. "How many?" More than 20. I stopped counting. Dragan stepped onto the axle, one hand on the side rail for height. From there he could see the escort better as the line lengthened through the trees. "They hold formation," he said. Milan nodded once. Officials in front. Dragan watched the front riders clear the lower bend. "Not ours. No. Not passing traders. No. Not men looking for a meal and a roof." Milan said nothing to that. He did not need to. Dragan climbed down at once. He did not go back to the wood. He went straight to the horse, gathered the reins, and swung himself onto the cart bench. The movement was so quick, it looked like a decision made before he moved at all. Milan took one step toward him. "They are coming this way." Dragan tightened the reins in both hands and glanced once more toward the road. "They're not passing through." He snapped the leather once over the horse's back. The animal surged into the traces and the cart jumped forward so hard the stacked wood knocked against itself in a single sharp rattle. By the time he hit the first lane, the sound of the cart had already begun the work. People turned before they heard words. A woman at the water trough lifted both hands from the cold water and stood still with it running from her fingers. Two boys, carrying a basket of onions, stopped in the path and nearly spilled half of them. A man on a roof straightened with a bundle of reeds under one arm and looked down into the lane. Dragan drove hard through the centre, wheels striking ruts, the horse breathing white into the air. "There are riders." Now heads turned fully. "From the south road." He hauled the horse toward the open ground by the well, where the village widened between the church path, the grain store, and the cluster of houses nearest the centre. "More than 20, armed." A man near the well stepped forward. "Whose riders?" Dragan pointed back the way he had come. "Not ours." Those words landed. Not ours. The fear moved quickly from face to face. A girl darted across the square and vanished into a doorway. A boy dropped his pail and ran uphill toward the outer houses. A woman standing beside a fence turned and called a name toward her yard. Then came the next line, passed from one mouth to another because everyone understood the difference. "They're coming here." From beside the grain store, Radovan emerged, fastening his coat, broad through the chest, moving with the blunt economy of a man used to being obeyed. People made room for him without being told. From the church, Father Danilo came quickly, one sleeve of his dark outer robe still hanging loose where he had pulled it on in haste. Behind him, the small church stood whitewashed and weathered, its low facade cracked near one corner, the cross above the entrance dark against the light sky. Radovan stopped before Dragan's cart. "What did you see?" "Officials in front," Dragan said. "Armed escort behind. They're holding formation, coming straight up from the south road." Radovan looked once toward the lane that opened to the road. Then he turned to the square and raised his voice just enough. "Bring your families in. Stay together." There was panic in the village, but everyone knew how to respond. This wasn't the first time that the riders came to the village. The townspeople moved with purpose, which made the fear visible in harder ways. Men left tools where they lay. An axe remained sunk in a chopping block beside one house. A woman pulled two children in from a yard, one by the shoulder, one by the hand. A grandmother stooped in a doorway, lifted a toddler from the earth and carried him inside against her chest. Doors closed. families began their preparations for dealing with the incoming riders, then opened again. Because everyone knew hiding in houses would not keep riders from entering them one by one. So families came out, gathered, emitting a false sense of calm, drawn toward the open centre where the well stood, where the Nez could speak to all of them, where the riders would expect to find the village waiting. The square itself began to fill. Chickens skittered from underfoot. A dog was kicked aside gently, but without apology. A cart was dragged a little farther back to clear the ground. Women took places with children in front or behind them, according to age. Men stood at the outer edge of their families and watched the road. By then, Petter was already crossing his threshold at home. Inside, the room held low autumn warmth from the hearth. Red coals glowed under a crust of grey ash. A loaf sat on the table under cloth. Flour dusted the board where Yelena had been working. Along the wall near the oven mouth, split kindling had been stacked in a neat shoulder-high row for the colder weeks to come. Marco knelt near the fire with a shaving knife in one hand and a thin piece of scrap wood in the other, carving with the careful seriousness only children give to things no adult has asked them to do. Small curls of pale wood lay around his knees. Melitza watched from the other side of the hearth, feet tucked beneath her. "That's not a rabbit." "It is. It looks like a skinny potato." "Then it's a rabbit made for winter." Melitza leaned closer and frowned at it. "Make the ears longer." He set the blade with more care. Near the table, Yelena folded the cloth tighter over the bread and brushed flour from her hands. She was still facing the board when the door opened and Petter came in. He did not slam it. He did not need to. His haste entered before he did. "They're coming to the village." Yelena turned. "Who?" "Riders from the South Road." That was enough. Her eyes went at once to Marco, then to Melitza. "Where do we hide him?" she asked frantically. Petter stood with one hand still on the door. For a breath, he did not move. "There's nowhere to put him," he said. His eyes had already searched the room while saying it. Hearth, bed, storage chest, the hanging cloth near the back wall, the bench, the corner by the wood. No cellar, no second room, no place that would survive a rider stepping 3 paces inside. Yelena reached the peg and took down a dark shawl. "Then we don't hide him. We have 2 daughters." Outside, faint through the wall, came the first dull rhythm of hooves from the lane. Petter crossed to Marco and took the knife from his hand before the boy could rise. He set it on the table. Marco looked from his father to his mother and stood without being told twice. Yelena put the shawl over his shoulders, drew it forward across his chest, and adjusted the fall of it with quick, sure hands, pulling one side higher, tucking the edge under his arm so it broke the line of his body. Melitza looked between them. "What's happening?" "Stay with me," Yelena said, and pulled her close with one arm. Petter bent toward Marco and spoke low, each word separate. "You don't speak. Not a word." Marco did not answer. His mouth tightened once. He watched his father's rough fingers fix the cloth at his shoulder. He watched the colour drain from his mother's face, while her hands kept moving, as if they belonged to someone calmer than the woman they were attached to. Outside, the hooves grew louder. Then they passed the first houses, then the next. By the time Petter led them out, the village was already in place. Families had gathered in the square. Men stood with wives and children close around them. Some house doors remained open behind them, dark interiors showing like wounds in the line of walls. Others had been shut against nothing. The riders entered without slowing. They came between the houses in the same order Milan had seen from the hill. Officials at the front, in dark wool cloaks, straight-backed, composed. Behind them, the armed escort rode in disciplined silence, spears upright, bridles held short, horses well kept and not overburdened. No one shouted at them. No one blocked the lane. The front rider lifted his hand as they reached the open centre. The entire column stopped at once. The silence afterward was heavier than the sound of the hooves had been. Radovan stepped forward from the front rank of villagers. Father Danilo came with him, but remained slightly behind and to one side, close enough to stand with him, far enough not to speak first. The front rider looked over them, then swung down from the saddle. He was not an old man. His beard was kept close and clean. His coat was dark and plain, well stitched at the edge. Nothing in his clothing was decorative. The authority around him came from the way the men behind him did not need to be told twice. This was Iskender. A groom took his reins. He handed them back without looking and came forward onto the bare earth of the square. "Who leads this village?" he asked. Radovan answered him without lowering his eyes. "I am Radovan, Nez here." Iskender inclined his head once. "The households will be assembled." "They are assembled." Iskender's gaze passed over the gathered villagers. Men, women, old people, children. The spacing between families. The attempts at calm. The places where calm had already failed at the hands, if not yet at the face. Father Danilo said, "These are Christian families." Iskender turned his head slightly toward him, then back to Radovan. "I can see that." Danilo did not let it go. "They have given no offense." "This is not punishment," Iskender said. "No," Danilo replied. "What is it then?" The priest's answer was quiet, but every adult in the square heard the meaning inside it.
Iskender took a folded sheet from his coat, glanced at it, then returned it to its place. "We will proceed in order. There will be no disorder." Radovan said, "There will be none." It was not agreement. It was the only shield left to a man with no weapon in his hand and a village at his back. Iskender looked at him for a breath longer, then said, "The boys, one at a time." No one moved. The square held still under that command, as if the ground itself had listened and gone hard. Then Radovan turned back toward his people. His face had changed, not broken, hardened. He named the first household. A father near the millstone put a hand between his son's shoulder blades and pushed him gently forward. The boy was perhaps 12, maybe a little more, with a good chest from work and hair that had been cut badly across the brow. He walked to the center and stopped where one of the escorts indicated. His father followed 2 paces behind. A soldier lifted a hand. "There!" The father stopped. The boy stood alone. Iskender stepped before him. "Stand straight." The boy straightened. A hand took his chin and turned his face toward the light. Another pressed the shoulder, then the other. The boy's arms were lifted, wrists turned. He was told to open his mouth. His teeth were inspected. He was made to take 3 steps, turn, and come back. The whole square watched. No one looked away. Iskender stepped back. There was a pause long enough for the father's fingers to flex once at his side. Then Iskender gave a single nod.
One of the escorts took the boy by the upper arm and led him away from his father toward the far side of the square, where two accepted boys would later stand under guard. The father did not move. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Only after his son had been placed aside did he turn and walk back to his household, where his wife stood with one hand pressed so hard over her own mouth the knuckles had gone pale. "Next," Iskender said. The second boy was smaller. He came forward with his mother tugging at his sleeve until his father took over and nudged him the rest of the way. He tried to plant his feet firmly as the first boy had done, but there was too much child left in the body for the effort to hold. Iskender looked at him once, then closer. The chin was lifted, the shoulders touched, the arm measured by the hand that closed around it. "No." The word came without force and without delay. The boy did not move at first because he had not understood that the word had freed him. His mother came before anyone could call her back, caught him by the wrist and pulled him against her so fast he stumbled into her skirts. She pressed his head to her side and shut her eyes once. "Next." The third boy limped. It showed only after a few paces, but it showed enough. Iskender watched him walk, watched him turn, and said, "No." The boy turned back immediately, already understanding before the word finished leaving the man's mouth. His father stepped out of the way to let him pass. Neither spoke. The father laid a hand on the back of the boy's neck as he returned, and left it there. "Next." The fourth came forward, trying to look older than he was. He had raised his chin too far and set his chest so high it made him look as if he were pushing his ribs through his skin. For a moment, it almost would have been laughable, if anything in the square had allowed laughter to exist. Iskender pressed one hand against the boy's shoulder and felt the frame under it. The wrists were turned, teeth shone. The boy held still through it. Longer pause this time, then the nod. An escort seized his arm and led him toward the others. The mother made a low sound then, half swallowed before it left her. She did not step forward. The father closed his eyes and kept them closed until the boy had been moved out of reach. "Next," the line continued. A boy with one clouded eye, rejected. A broad-shouldered one with dirt still ground into the backs of his hands from work in the field, accepted. A thin boy near Marco's age, whose tunic hung too loosely at the collar, rejected. Another, older, with the beginning of a man's jaw already visible, accepted. Now the pattern itself became part of the cruelty. The square could see it forming. Not all, not random. Bodies judged in daylight by frame, teeth, back, shoulder, movement. Each decision made without heat, without hurry, without apology. That was what made the silence around it so unbearable. If the riders had shouted or struck people, fear might have burst and spent itself. But this was a system being carried out as if order were enough to cleanse it. Marco watched from behind the edge of Jelena's shoulder. He saw what mattered. How accepted boys were not allowed to return to their families, even for a final touch. How rejected boys came back stunned and guilty, as if their relief had to be hidden from those still waiting. How fathers stepped forward only when summoned. How mothers held still in the mouth and failed only in the fingers. how Father Danilo stood rigid beside Radovan, his lips moving once or twice without sound. Beside him, Milica shifted her weight impatiently and afraid. She did not understand the shape of what was happening. She knew only that everyone had become wrong at once. Jelena's hand found Marco's wrist beneath the shawl and pressed. "Stay." Another boy was called. This one had good height but narrow shoulders. Iskander turned him once, set a hand against the back, and frowned slightly. Not in pity, not in doubt, but in assessment. He said something to the man beside him in Ottoman Turkish. The villager hearing it could not understand the words, but the point of them was plain enough. Rejected. The boy's father breathed out so sharply it was almost a cough. He pulled his son back beside him and looked away at once, ashamed of the relief that had escaped him. Then came a broader boy, older than Marco by perhaps 2 years. His wrists were thick from work. He held himself well. Iskander examined him longer than the others. He pressed his shoulder, then his back, then turned the wrist over in his hand and looked at the palm. At last he nodded. The father took half a step forward. A spear shaft moved across his chest before his second foot could follow. He stopped there, not resisting, not retreating. His son looked once over his shoulder as he was led away. Only then did the father step back. The space of waiting families grew smaller as more boys were moved out of it. Those still in line stood closer together. Mothers drew younger children tighter to them. Men stopped shifting their feet. Everyone had learned by then that time did not help those still to come. Iskander moved through it all with the same measured composure he had brought into the square. He did not bark. He did not threaten. He did not touch anyone more than was necessary to judge them. That made him more frightening, not less. Anger would have made him human in a way the villagers could answer. Procedure made him a wall. When he reached Petar's family, he slowed. His eyes passed over Jelena first, then Milica, then the wrapped figure kept slightly behind them. "How many children?" he asked. Petar answered at once. "2 daughters." Iskander looked at him, then at Jelena, then again at the figure behind her. He did not raise his voice. "Move aside." No one moved. An escort shifted to a pace nearer. In silence, Radovan closed his eyes once and opened them again. Iskander repeated, no louder than before, "Move aside." Jelena remained where she was for 1 heartbeat more. Then she stepped to the left, with Milica caught by the shoulder. Marco stood revealed under the shawl. He had already seen it. The way the shawl fell too stiff across the shoulders. The way the body beneath it held tension instead of softness. The silence that was not fear alone, but instruction. This was not the first village, not the first mother, not the first boy dressed in hope. There was no gasp from the square. The fear there had passed beyond sound. Iskander regarded the boy. "Name." Marco remembered his father's words. "You don't speak, not a word." He said nothing. Petar's voice came rougher than before. "Marco. Age 11. Iskander reached out, took the edge of the shawl between 2 fingers and pulled it back from the shoulders. Underneath, Marco's tunic was plain and patched at one elbow. He was narrow from the season, but the bones were straight, the limbs sound. "Forward." Marco stepped out. Petar's hand twitched once at his side,
and then clenched so hard the tendons stood in his wrist. One of the escorts turned Marco by the shoulders. Another lifted his chin. His arms were raised, wrists examined, back touched, jaw set and turned toward the light. He was told to walk. He walked. To turn. He turned. To stop. He stopped. He bore it with the stunned obedience of a child who has discovered that the body can keep doing what it is told while the mind lags somewhere far behind. Father Danilo spoke then. He is small. Iskander did not look at him. He will grow. That was when Milica understood enough. Not all of it. Not the levy. Not empire. Not why the men had come from the South Road in ordered pairs and stopped in the square and put hands on boys like animals at market. Only this. Marco had been pulled away from the place where he belonged, and no one was putting him back. She slipped free of Yelena's hand and ran the few steps forward. Before anyone caught her, she threw both arms around Marco's waist.
The nearest escort moved instantly. Iskander lifted a hand without turning, and the soldier stopped. Milica clung with all the strength in her little body. "Marco!" That was all she got out at first. Her voice broke on his name. Yelena came to them, fast but not wild. She did not strike the girl's hands away. She reached down and began freeing them one by one, because that was the only way they would come loose. Milica fought her mother, in the only way she could, only with grief. She twisted, grabbed again, caught the edge of the shawl, lost it, seized at Marco's sleeve. Then the crying came fully. Not loud all at once. It tore itself out of her in broken pulls, as if each breath had to drag the next one behind it. Yelena gathered her against her chest and held her there, while Milica kicked once against the earth and reached over her mother's arm toward her brother. Yelena's own face had still not broken. That made it harder to look at her. Her mouth trembled once and stopped. She fixed her eyes on Marco, as if by doing so, she could still place something into him that would keep once he was gone. A warning, a blessing, a command. None of them could cross the square now. Petr had not moved. He stood where he was, with both hands open and empty. He did not beg. He did not shout. In another world, perhaps a father would have thrown himself forward and forced the scene into blood. But not in this square. Not with spears already angled. Not with the accepted boys watching. Not with a village full of younger children behind him and armed men waiting only for the excuse to make an example of someone. That calculation did not lessen the pain in him. It made it uglier. He looked at his son the way a man looks at a house already burning when he has no water left to carry. Iskander spoke to the escort. "Put him with the others." The soldier took Marco by the arm. Marco turned his head once toward his family. Milica was still crying against Yelena's shoulder, her face wet, her small hand opening and closing in the air, as if she still expected to find cloth or sleeve in it. Yelena held her close. Petr stood rooted in the same spot. Father Danilo had lowered his head, not in submission, but in helpless fury. Radovan's face had become stone. The accepted boys stood under guard near the well. Marco was led to them and placed among their number. He did not resist, not because he was unafraid, because fear had reached the point where it no longer knew what form resistance could take. The selection continued after him. The square did not stop for the grief of Peter's house. Another name was called. Another boy stepped forward. Another mother watched. Another father held still. The machine did not pause simply because one family had reached the end of what it could bear. By the time the last boy had been judged, the light was lower over the roofs, and the air had gone sharper. Long shadows from the houses crossed the square in dark bars. A hen wandered foolishly near the well and was kicked away by one of the escorts. The accepted boys were counted. One absent-mindedly wiped his face with the back of his hand and left a wet streak there. Another stared straight ahead, not noticing anything before him. One older boy had set his jaw with such force the muscle jumped in his cheek. Marco stood among them, with the shawl slipping from one shoulder. At last, the escort moved them into line, on foot between the horses. That choice alone said enough. They were not guests, not recruits who had chosen, not boys being honored. They were being removed. Milica saw the line shift and began crying harder again, as if some buried part of her had believed until then that once the sun lowered enough, or enough names had been called, someone would undo everything. Yelena bent and put both hands on her daughter's face, forcing her to look at her. She said something too low for others to hear. Milica shook her head violently and buried her face again. Peter took one step forward then. Only one. Not toward the riders, toward his son. The nearest escort lowered his spear a fraction. Peter stopped. Marco saw him. For a heartbeat, the square held on that distance between them. The father's single step, the son's fixed place in line, the spear not yet touching flesh and not needing to. Peter let the step remain where it was. He did not take another. Iskender mounted. The other officials did the same. The line began to move. Horses first, careful through the square. Then the escorted boys between them. Then the rearguard. Marco walked when the line moved because the boys before him had moved and the men beside him expected him to. As he passed the place where his family stood, he turned once. He saw Milica in Yelena's arms, still reaching, though there was nothing left to reach for. He saw his mother's face, white with effort, and held together only because breaking would help no one. He saw his father standing in the square, with both hands hanging at his sides, like things no longer attached to purpose. Then the line carried him past them, out between the houses, toward the south road. No one in the village followed. They stood in the open ground and listened to the sound of hooves, harness, and boys' feet diminish between the bare trees. Only when the last of it had gone did the square begin to come apart. Not all at once. A mother crossed to the place where her son had stood and found nothing there. One father turned away before his knees could fail him in public. A child who had not understood the day asked a question no one answered. Father Danilo remained beside the well, with one hand on the worn stone rim, his head bowed. Radovan stood in the middle of the square and looked at the road as if memorizing its shape would let him hate it better. At Peter's house, the place Marco had occupied in the world had already begun to harden into absence. The shaving knife still lay where Peter had set it down. The unfinished rabbit remained by the hearth. Milica stood just inside the doorway. Her face was wet. Her breathing came uneven, catching on itself as she tried to quiet it. For a long moment, she did not move. Then she stepped forward. She crouched near the hearth and picked up the rabbit with both hands. The wood was light, rough where the blade had not yet smoothed it. The ears were short, too short.
She turned it slightly, looking at it through the blur of her tears, as if the shape might change if she held it long enough. Her mouth opened, ready to tell him again, "Make the ears longer." No sound came. Her fingers tightened around the small carved body. Behind her, the house was quiet, and Marco was gone. The devşirme was not chaos. It was not a raid. It was a system. Officials like Iskender did not come to punish families. They came to collect, and they expected resistance. Boys were hidden, disguised, passed off as something they were not. It rarely mattered. The men who carried out the levy had seen it all before. They did not need confession, only bodies. And once a boy was chosen, there was no appeal, no negotiation, no return. But for those taken, this was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of something far more complicated. In the next part, we follow Marco beyond the village, into a world that will strip away everything he was and remake him into something the Empire could use. If you want to see that transformation, make sure to subscribe. And if this story stood out to you, let me know in the comments.